Hello and welcome to Beyond Top 10 Tennis. My name is Dr. Ashley Morgan-Berge and I'm your host. I'm the author of 11 books, a CEO of 12 years, the founder of a startup set on data privacy, most importantly an elite performance coach of over 18 years, having worked with athletes throughout Europe, the United States to Australia. And most excitingly, I am the world's leading scientist on coach and athlete performance, specifically behind how to develop a top 10 tennis ranking. My work includes everything from mitigating injuries to conditioning behaviors that set a player up long term for the long game towards a top 10 tennis ranking. I'm behind theories from the optimal performance theory, optimal behavior for optimal performance, the barrier breaker, the rule of transference to the golden rule. As has become custom, each episode we dive into one of my books to share additional insights and dig a little bit deeper. We've been focusing on the secrets to optimal coaching success, the role of experience, optimal performance practices, and outcomes in the real world, with well over now 50 episodes to date. Today's topic plays its own role, like so many other episodes, in developing the player, parent, and coach for that road ahead towards a top 10 tennis ranking. So, as always, buckle in and enjoy the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today, whether you're new or you've been around for some time now. Thank you so much. Would you believe it that today marks the start of the second chapter of the secrets to optimal coaching success, which means we have that whole chapter now behind us, including the entire everything involved or encompassed in the secrets to optimal performance success. So the first text, obviously, we dived into and shared those additional insights. So if you are new, and I do say this, I think nearly every single episode, please do catch up on that extensive catalogue now we have to date. But this is episode 55, believe it or not. So which really marks, I think, around the fifth episode we've been diving into the secrets to optimal coaching success, and it really has been setting, I think, a new pattern. And I'm sure for those who are familiar with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, it's quite a different take. So it is a bit of a pivot, and I think it's quite clear in that respect to how we've progressed. And look, today's chapter, or chapter 2, is on behavioral awareness in sport. And I think in most of our episodes, we really do share those behavioral insights, because it's just so important to recognize that tennis players are individuals, but they're also more often than not children to young adults. So specifically, throughout that developmental spectrum. I think that, in the young adult, we can argue they might cut off around 23, 24 years of age, for example, or even 25. And then onwards is just an adult. Because in the real world, so away from the tennis courts, we can look at, the younger adults in that respect. And typically they're not viewed, I guess, depending obviously where you're based around the world, until, mid-20s or later, where that perception changes. And it's really important, I think, to shed awareness on this, because when we're looking at those behavioral implications, and we just take a step back from the tennis court, so from, I think, the dynamics that are in play on court, and when we slightly pivot away and shine, I think, a different lens around, those age ranges and what constitutes an adult in this respect, we kind of have different opinions. And unfortunately or fortunately, tennis is actually a very young person's sport in this respect, because typically you have players reaching, say, the peak of their career in their mid to late 20s, and they end up retiring from the game at some stage, more often than not, say mid 30s to late 30s. And the fun part I'm saying in this respect is that in the real world, so away from the courts, going off the play obviously of the title, we're looking at people normally don't hit that mid-career milestone. So mid-career, they're in their 30s or late 30s, peak career in their, early 40s, or within that, age bracket to 50s. And then later on in their career, obviously, when we're looking at later 50s, 60s, 70s, and so forth, depending how long your working career is. And obviously the retirement age is then after you've reached that 60 plus typically. And this really varies again where you're based in the world, and so it's very generalized. These are just more so general figures, I guess, from more so Western society, and more specifically being based in Australia, though there are no clear statistics. These are purely examples here, and so I'm sharing that from how we view the behavioral implications on the tennis court. And you have the very young player, whether they're 11, 12, 13, within that developmental spectrum. And recall our last episode when we touched on the developmental player, the developmental elite player. So they could be 21, 22, 23 years of age, but they're still developing those elite peak performance cycles. So recall that we move from one peak performance cycle to the next and to the next, and that's essentially the end goal. It's not as such a level of maintenance, and we touched on that in last episode as well. That level of maintenance is what we want when we're inside the top 10, but we still need to continue reaching those peak performance cycles, because if our competitors are, which more often than not, those 9 other players inside the top 10, if you are in the top 10, they are looking to reach that next peak performance cycle. And obviously the ones external to the top 10, the same applies, but that luxury of just maintaining a level is incredibly rare, because if those are those patterns of play we've touched on, so that one peak performance continues to progress, they're the players who are more likely positioned to go further in a Grand Slam and then eventually win that Grand Slam. So again, recall in the last 2 to 3 episodes, we've really digged a bit deeper, and I've shared those additional insights on those peak performance cycles and specific metrics, and why we've got specific players who win Grand Slams at this moment in time, those who have not, those that we knew who were going to win Grand Slams and that they have, by leveraging our predictive analytics that it's really shared and dived into deeper in the 7 keys to optimize your life. But most importantly, and that is really pivotal here, is when we're looking at those behavioral implications. And obviously ingrained in that is the 7 keys. And I really have been, I think, running home the 7 keys in the last couple of episodes, probably more so than I think in the past, because, and as I shared in our last episode again, because there was a lot there, this latest text that's coming out in time for Christmas, so please get ready, unpack something that we weren't sure was there and or was possible and or if it was ever going to be released. And that's the 8th key, which I did promise a last episode that I would begin to share more insights in this respect. And it's really exciting because it's essentially piecing together the puzzle. And it's one of the, I think, the most exciting benchmarks in this respect is how the 8th key delivers the 8%. And what I mean by that is that we now know why, and we've got the data. So those who are not familiar, these aren't just opinions or substantiated opinions or pure subjective opinions. We're talking about, we've got the scientific rigor on our side, quantitative and qualitative in this respect. And the best part is, because we're looking at how do you secure that, obviously, that top 10 tennis ranking and stay, and recall the barrier breaker, which are new players every season, and we know this is continuous over our longitudinal analyses and studies, etc. That new ones happen every season, and which means top 10 players lose their place. New ones come in, and current top 10 players, they regress. So they go, whether it's 11, 12, 13 in the world or further, it's a regression nonetheless. And those who progress into the top 10 are a progression nonetheless. But we're talking about the ones who are able to stay inside the top 10 now. And that's really what the 8th key is solidifying and running home, is that if you want to hold on to that place inside the top 10, this is explicitly what's absolutely paramount. The good news for those of you who've been following along and have become familiar with the 7 keys is that the 7 keys are absolute. You still need the 7 keys. They are absolutely pivotal. The 7 keys will get you there. The 7 keys will get you into the top 10. But we're looking at the 8th key now, which is explicitly the top 10 and maintaining that hold. And we know we've touched on the correlations there about winning your maiden Grand Slam to replicated success, so winning more than one Grand Slam championship, which most players aspire to. Just win one, and then multiple is incredible, and we have the data that underpins why and how you can win that multiple. And it's so important to highlight that all of this work is based on the best players in the world. And recall, I think in a previous episode, we touched on the top 4, for example, which means the players who got to 20 Grand Slams first. So the likes of a Federer, Serena Williams, to Nadal, and then Djokovic. And obviously the latter is still active, and potentially those slams are going to continue to climb. I mean, we'll start to see next season, which is a very exciting time, and why I think this book is being released in time to be able to showcase, come the Australian Open, how the 8th key really runs things home. But look, today's topic, this chapter, whether it's on obviously behavioural awareness in sport, today's primary topic is on age interactions, which is involved really explicitly in the behavioural side. So we've touched on the age interactions, and in a manner of speaking, we're looking at the developmental spectrum, where we've got those 2. So recall again previous episode, where you have the initial developmental, so the first 10 years of play, and the second developmental, which is that second 10 years of play. And when we're touching on the young adults, where they're potentially 19, 20 through to even 25, 26 potentially years of age, where they're still typically viewed as a young adult. Young adult can stretch even further, so this is very generalized. But when we're looking, I think, in the terms of tennis and WTA and or ATP Tour, these players unfortunately are more often than not looked as more senior players, which is quite concerning in some areas, but we won't go there. However, when you're looking at the behavioural implications to expectations, certain, I think, behaviours that occur from these players almost they're acceptable to normalise, because in the real world, again, this is what a typical 25, 26-year-old would potentially behave like, just as an example. And we have to be very conscious, all those players really have to be on point in this respect, that because of their role model status, they have to grow up sooner. They have to grow up a lot more readily compared to their peers who are not, I think, in the public eye. Now, we do have episodes on mentorship and the role model status, etc. Previously, but opposed to, I guess, focusing on that today, we really want to look at the age interactions, which is very clear when you are, let's say, inside the top 100. And you can look at the top 10, for example, and you've got players from 19, 20 years of age, for example, through to 36 years of age. So the age range is incredibly diverse. You've got the early 20s to late 20s to early 30s. It's incredibly diverse now, which is really exciting because we're seeing the current generation, in a manner of speaking, being pushed with the next generation of play. And you can have for example, that Alcaraz is leading the pack, though I would argue that is that is the current generation of player, and we've got Djokovic, who was in the previous generation, who is now in the current generation, and then he's holding onto his level of performance to match this new generation, which is again a very interesting discussion to be had. Though recall again, in our previous episodes we've touched on why Djokovic has been able to maintain this hold, and it's because how he exhibits the 7 keys and applies to integrate those 7 keys. And it's so important to underscore here the top 4, and obviously that the data interactions that have happened obviously over the course of more than the 11 years that this work has been ongoing, to the 20 years from when it obviously came to life, which is a significant amount of time. But when we're looking, I think, more specifically at those age interactions, when you are on tour, it essentially goes away. And when I mean goes away, it does not matter what age you're at once you've written a certain skill. And I would argue that potentially this is where, when you're inside the top 100 to top 50, it's more even spread. Potentially, it's more heavily weighted than on experience. So you could have a player who's been ranked 80 in the world for the last 2-3 years. However, it's incredibly dangerous when you have a player that's ranked 100 in the world who has been ranked 100 for about 2-3 months, and they are at their peak. So recall the peak performance cycles. That player ranked 80 in the world is a lot more vulnerable to be displaced, to regress against that top 100 player, because they have not reached a plateau. Their performance is continuing to progress, continuing to reach those peak performance levels that we've touched on in the past. And that is why we see a lot of players, irrespective if they're ranked 80 in the world, 30 in the world, 20 in the world, why they don't progress, why they stay. And we've touched on, I think, maybe not the best descriptive, that they stagnate. So their performance is just a plateau, it's stagnated. But they have a level of maintenance that allows them to hold onto that level of play. But we're now talking about the progressions, the players that overtake them and overtake them and overtake them, because it's cyclical. And so recall, we've had episodes on this, how it's a cycle, and they're continuing to repeat that peak performance cycle, and then the next peak performance cycle, and it's progressing. So it's not the same. Those cycles are not the same. They go up a level, then up a level. So we go 80 in the world, then 70 in the world, to 50 in the world, etc. Because those performances are continuing to peak. And that's essentially what that initial 10 years of play to the following 10 years of play is all about. When you are integrating the 7 keys, and the What's Your Game Missing series really sheds light on the applications, most specifically when we're looking at the technical parameters, but more so, I think this latter book that is on its way digs even more insights into the non-technical components. So behind the scenes, what's going on, what needs to happen, those interactions. So recall again, I think the last, parts of 1 through to 5. So episodes, I think they were around episodes 45 to 50, for example, how there was a refresher on the coach-athlete relationship, and it was very substantial. So there's like a good 5 to 6 episodes in this respect. And it's really taking it to the next level, because performance is one side, but behind the scenes is the other. So that is why you have players who are absolutely phenomenal on court, but their ranking does not correlate with that exceptional performance, because we're talking about behind the scenes, we need them both to align, both to pair up. And you go, okay, how does this tie into age interactions? Well, first, we're talking about the behavioral components. So second, then, when we're looking at the age interactions, we have to be very mindful of the progressions and the expectations of a given age range, what we can expect of that 12, 13-year-old to what we can expect from that 21 to 22-year-old. And it is not universal, and that is so important, that one 21-year-old is not going to have the same, I think, needs that should be accommodated or set behavioral implications as the next 21-year-old. So again, recall episodes on modification to accommodating the athlete and individualization. So every episode we like touching on that humanized approach, which is so important, because at the end of the day, tennis player, coach, parent, guardian, irrespective, we're all individuals. You are all individuals, which means you perceive things in a different way. How you perceive something is not going to be the same as your best friend. How your best friend perceives something is not going to be the same as your next door neighbor, which is very generalized, I acknowledge. But for example, so when we're on the tennis court, from one player is not going to perceive something exactly the same as the next. And it's so important when we're looking at the intricacies of that coach-athlete relationship, so the complexities that underlie optimizing that relationship that obviously correspond with a top 10 tennis ranking. And this is where we're going, and where those age interactions can take us to, that level of behavioral awareness. So within that first 10 years of play, it's more pivotal. More often than not, age interactions are typically frowned upon until the levels are more clear. And what I mean by that, until that 12-year-old really just clearly beats that 16-year-old, maybe they'll get to interact on the same court. But then potentially, if they do, then they don't. And there's a lot of, I think, it gets very, for lack of better wording, political, very judgmental, not inclusive. And this is across the board, irrespective of where I've been based. However, I would say that there are, and this is very general, the level of accommodation from the varying age ranges, I think, are more broad, primarily I want to say in Europe to North America, more so than Australia, which is very disheartening to say. But every club academy has different approaches, so it's something to be very mindful of, which is to say that I'm sure that there are academies based in Australia that I've not seen firsthand that potentially does accommodate, age variances. But I have seen this irrespective of where I've been based or where I've been. So it's so important to have that discussion, and for coaches to be mindful of, and players to parents to guardians as well, that when you're in this developmental age range, you could be 9 years of age to 19 years of age, there is always something you can learn from that other player. For example, if that 9-year-old is playing with that 19-year-old, that 19-year-old might want to be working on their drop shot, as an example. The 9-year-old is looking at their level of consistencies to their footwork, and the scale is going to be very different, but there is always something you can learn. Speed of movement, for example, is absolutely paramount for that 19-year-old. Working with or hitting with that 9-year-old if their ball falls short, not where I think that level of control would be expected of that 19-year-old. So the underlying lessons here can be incredibly powerful, and that's really what we're focusing on today, because when you, I think, move into that second decade of play, age discrepancies, variances, interactions, they're a given, and you cannot control the age of your opponent, etc. Fortunately, but also unfortunately, in some cases, you obviously in the junior ranks you have those age ranges, which are very good to show an even playing field in some respects. However, if you have that 11-year-old that keeps thumping and trumping every single player that is 11 years of age, it's because they're at a different level. They are not playing in alignment with their age. And so that's where I think the discrepancies are, because it goes off the standard of play at that given time. That player could be a semi-full-time player compared to, I think, the more, casual player. Although that really does open up another can of worms, and it's a very big discussion. So we really want to recenter and draw the focus today on the wins that can be had from interacting at different ages. So it's really focused on those initial 10 years of play. I recall, for example, and it was very disheartening when I was a player, being put with those who were similar age, but they're more often than not, they were actually younger than me, and my ability was higher than theirs at this time. And the other players who had beaten me in matches were on other courts, were similar ages, but because I had had that loss, irrespective of how I was playing, I was positioned on another court or courts with those who were not as effective. Now, for that player at that time, so for me at the time, it was very disheartening. Now, what would fix this would be the interactions, would be dispersing talent in this respect, not explicitly going off results, because we can acknowledge every single player is they're going to get pounced. They're going to get, I'm not a big fan of this expression, but that bagels happen in this respect. But we're looking at that level of upkeep, that level of maintenance, that level of consistency, that level of performance that they're able to show day in and day out, not just the match results. And this is really important for coaches to be mindful of. But also, if you put your best player at your academy with one of your weaker players, I can guarantee you both are going to improve and get better. Now, it's typically frowned upon and or scarcely done, because the ego of the best player at the academy goes, no, I'm too good to hit with, the weaker player. Obviously, the weaker player can feel very intimidated, irrespective of the age interactions here, because of their skills. But then it can be incredibly rewarding for both of them to learn something. Obviously, the ego comes down a notch, and hopefully, if you have a player whose ego is not involved, whose ego is not hurt and or offended by this, the likelihood when we're looking at the behavioral implications and when we're setting the stage for that well-rounded player, that well-rounded adult with healthy boundaries, with healthy, progressions, that really showcases and underscores if that is the type of player they are. If you are, leading the way by example for those coaches to really ensure you are developing a well-rounded player, that in turn, when you're looking towards that second decade of play, they're going to be an absolutely incredible role model. And some, former players we can look at as from a Federer, and you can even look at the Serena, and even active, it's obviously Venus still. And or current players we can look at as Swiatek to Alcaraz to Sinner, for example, to Osaka to Gauff. The really healthy examples that are being set on tour now by a lot of the younger players leading the way inside the top 10 is absolutely phenomenal, and it really should be, be applauded in this respect, because I think this has to be one of the only times we get to see that level of interaction in the best possible way. And I think it's because it's been encouraged, and then the players have been taking that into their own hands, whereas in years past or generations past, there was typically viewed as there was a very, I think, big divide between players, or it was viewed that way. The perception was shaped that way, so that level of inclusion was not necessarily there. It was more so, no, we are competitors first, friends second, or colleagues second. Whereas now I think that view is changing. We are colleagues to potentially friends first, and then when we are on the court, of course, game on. All right, now I think that was a really healthy, laid out introduction when we're really looking at the scope of age interactions. So look, if you want to follow along today, we are on page 58. So here we go. There is no distinct correlation between age, performance interactions, and the quality or caliber of the player athlete that is interacting. That is, regardless of the age of a player athlete, this does not dictate that age of the player athlete that they train or practice with from time. The same is applicable for the standard of the player athlete and the level of play performance. This neither dictates whom a player athlete trains or practices with from time. This is really important, and I was endeavoring to touch on earlier. It's about, if you have a player that is 11 years old and another one who is 15 years of age, both of them could have been playing or practicing the game of tennis for 6 months, both of them, which goes to show, and if their rate of progress is very similar, there is nothing that should be stopping those two from playing together, and is also highlighting the why. You could have an 11-year-old who's been playing for 6 years and another 11-year-old who's been playing for 2 months. Now, by all accounts, they can play together whilst acknowledging strengths and weaknesses. However, when we're looking at that level of experience, they're better equipped to play with others who have been playing for that period of time. But it's very important, I have to share and say for the coaches out there, to interchange this. So to not group experience explicitly together, to ensure that ages also cross over, because you have to be very mindful that most of these players, athletes, children are at school, or they're going through that developmental age range where their friends or their closest friends are typically around their age. And potentially, when you either put them up an age range or down an age range, there can be quite unaddressed vulnerabilities there. And 10 years prior we could have thought otherwise, but now it's really important, and we've shared episodes on mental health, mental well-being, just emotional well-being, and being able to condition that and be really mindful of that. And you wouldn't think age interaction would be reason for concern, but I have to share that it's something that it should be, coaches need to be very mindful of, specifically within that first 10 years of play, because of, yes, the behavioural implications that was touched on earlier, but more so the vulnerabilities that can be experienced, where that 11-year-old playing with a 15-year-old, and if that 15-year-old, even if they are new, and even if that 11-year-old is better on court than that 15-year-old may feel inferior, and they may not enjoy themselves and think they're playing with someone their sibling's age, for example, if that person obviously has a sibling of that age. Again, a very big generalization, but making sure there's a crossover, so a level of inclusion with age interactions of the same age and varying ages is really powerful and empowering at the same time for those players. So we can look at age interactions, sure, put all the 11, 12-year-olds together by all accounts, but then don't disperse them across all of the age ranges you have, whether it's down to the 6-7-year-olds or up to the 16-17-year-olds. Yes, please do that. So coaches who practice that level of diversification, they are the ones following the primary principles that underscore the 7 keys. Now, I'm not saying they're following all of them. I'm saying these are key characteristics included in a coach's pedagogic practices that are incredibly healthy. And we know one of many that this one practice is incredibly conducive to building, obviously, that healthy coach-athlete relationship. And of course, every single key is incredibly, I think, diverse and multifaceted, with many moving pieces within or encompassed within each respective key. But this specific behavior and ability to diversify, to ensure there's that level of inclusion and that level of mindfulness with your players, your athletes, that child, your children, for their parents and or guardians out there, it's incredibly important. Too often than not, there is a common misconception that if a player is better than you, you should only practice or train with them. The same goes for age. If they're older than the player athlete, there is often an immediate perception prior to the professional ranks league that they are better to practice or train with, in contrast to a player athlete of the same age or younger. These are merely fallacies that are now being put to rest. This really touches on, I think, the discussion earlier about if you play with someone, if you are that 12-year-old and you're playing with that 16-year-old, obviously the 12-year-old is going to go, I am incredible, if you're basing age on skill level. Whereas that 16-year-old could have been playing just for 6 months compared to the younger player for 6 years again. So the irony here is that there is zero crossover in skill transference. I mean, yes, but when we're looking at the level of performance, typically that 12-year-old or the 11-year-old, for the example earlier, is better equipped and more skilled than the older player. And this can be quite detrimental then and disheartening for that older player to deal with. So it's really pivotal for the coach to change the conversation with that athlete to know why they're playing with that player. So to not base their level of skill on age, we're basing it on quality. So quality of performers. The same applies for that, again, that 16-year-old, and in this case, if they are the better player, they've been playing for the past 10 years, they're on the cusp of entering that second decade of play, for example. And if they go to play with a 10-year-old, and that 10-year-old has been playing for 1 year, now we're expecting the 10-year-old not really to be able to get many balls back. However, let's change the conversation again for the 10-year-old to that 16-year-old. The 10-year-old, this is an incredible challenge, an example of where we're going to progress your performance in the next, say, 4 to 5 years as a baseline. The 16-year-old, why are you playing with someone, or why do I want you to practice with someone who I know you can wipe off the court really easily? I want you to practice your level of skill and control with your opposite hand. Or I want you to practice getting the ball in irrespective where that ball lands, and just amplifying that level of speed in your footwork. I want to make sure you hit every single ball on the full. I want you to volley every single ball irrespective where it is on the court. I want you to work on your level of control in this respect. Whilst a 10-year-old is really looking at getting the ball back, making sure it lands at a specific part or place in the court, looking at can they get the ball to bounce over the service line each and every time, or just inside the baseline each and every time. Can they get the ball to their opponent's forehand every single time? There are so many, I think, options to make it an incredibly versatile experience, which means it goes on and on. It's not just a one-off occasion. I would encourage this on a weekly basis, not a monthly basis, a weekly basis, these type of interactions, because each player lifts one another up. After that 10-year-old is finished, they are going to feel on top of the world. After the 16-year-old is finished, they are going to feel a renewed sense of confidence in their performance, knowing that irrespective if their player or their opponent was not at the same level, they were still able to work on some really important facets of play. Now, the good news is here for both of them, when they're in competition, so when they're in matches, that 10-year-old is going to come up against opponents potentially with similarities to that 16-year-old that really want to wipe them off the court. And that 10-year-old's going to remember that level of consistency to just try to get the ball back. And it is a pattern of play they are able to impart because they have been practicing it. It's been a part of their development when we're looking at the developmental spectrum, which we previously touched on. The 16-year-old, they're going to come across opponents like the 10-year-old, those other 16-year-olds who have maybe only been playing for a few months or that 1 to 2 years, or their rate of progress is quite, it's slower in comparison. So that 16-year-old is going to remember, okay, that level of patience, that they have that speed to pull on, but they need to be patient to control the ball, to execute each and every point as desired, whilst maintaining that level of respect for their opponent. So there are really good, I think, direct performance lessons to be learned with these interactions, but also indirect lessons that can be learned. There is one distinct difference here that is to be mentioned to ensure that this fallacy is clear. The age and or level of a player-athlete does matter when it comes to their training group. Each player-athlete will always have something to offer the next player-athlete, and insofar as the training group is concerned, the age of the player-athlete simply needs to be accounted for, i.e. player-athlete development, and the level of that player-athlete to ensure that each player or athlete has the same attitude and that no player or athlete takes away from another's training environment in any way, shape or form. This is not dictated by age, and that is such an important conversation that we're going to finish on, because it really highlights the opinions or the biases that are I think almost ingrained in a lot of players, athletes. And again, we need to remember the behavioral implications here, and obviously that's really what the chapter's about, is the interactions or the behaviors that happen because of a certain age range. You may expect a 10, 11-year-old to behave this way because of their age. Same goes for that 14, 15-year-old because of their age. However, you can reshape that on the courts or on the training grounds, and you need to make sure those attitudes are conducive. If you have a 10-year-old, a 16-year-old, and a 9-year-old, and a 12-year-old all on the same court, because their abilities are incredibly similar, you need to just make sure their attitudes are in check, which means let's make sure that the older players acknowledge why they're on court and the rewards with, I think, the other players, what they can learn of that 10-year-old, that 9-year-old as well. But like I shared earlier, it's still so important to make sure that, you know, the 15, 14-year-olds, etc., still are surrounded by players of the same age. Really, I think, chop and change that, because, again, we need to acknowledge the level of vulnerability here, and that they might not feel good enough, or they might feel inferior, and that's all a part of the developmental spectrum when we're really looking at the behavioural patterns, connotations, associations, etc., which really are non-performance related. They are still present because they are still children under a child. They're still individuals. So again, recall that humanized approach. So when we are on the court, we really need to account for, I think, these variances and be incredibly mindful of accommodating these needs, especially when they're on the pathway and they're following the long game towards that top 10 tennis ranking. thank you so much for listening. I know we just wrapped that up a bit quickly, but at the same time, I think those topics, they're just so important when we're looking at age interactions and really setting the scene for the long game and that pathway ahead. Look, to grab a copy of The Secrets to Optimal Coaching Success, head on over to AM8 International. That is am8international.com. For any comments or questions, head to AM8 or Topic Thread, the social platforms that on data privacy. To interact with Beyond Top 10 Tennis, head on over to Twitter, Threads, LinkedIn or Instagram. To catch up on our weekly coaching tips, head on over to TikTok. And to catch up on our blogs, head on over directly to AM8 International and look for our blogs tab there, or to Medium. And as always, I'll leave all of the links in the episode notes. For something different, head on over to Pink Octopus Books. That's where my fictional release is. To view this week's question and poll, be sure to visit Spotify, or for something left of field, visit Spruik for some random polls. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, like, share, and all of the above will be absolutely phenomenal. And look, on that topic, I'd really love to hear feedback in respect to age interactions. What's worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? For the coaches, how you diversify, how you, I think, implement that. The parents or guardians, how you feel about that when you're a part of that triangular relationship. If this is something that your child gets to experience playing with, I think, other children of higher levels, lower levels, and I think the feedback cycle there internally, so intrinsic and extrinsic feedback, what they have to say to you, to the coach, that within that coach-athlete relationship, that level of accommodation. I really need to highlight how it can be very complex, but it really starts with, I think, that level of interaction and being able to, I think, ascertain the performance gains, especially when we're looking at key metrics of development within, again, we can look at the developmental spectrum, but also the behavioral implications, which really was what today was all about, whilst highlighting age interactions within that first decade of play, because within that second decade of play, we know that it's everywhere, that age is really taken off the table when the performances are there. You can have now a 19-year-old winning a Grand Slam as well as a 36-year-old, which is an incredibly topic in and of itself to discuss. And we really want to set those foundations up that let's not discriminate against a player in this respect because of their age. And this starts at the baseline, so at the very beginning. And we really want to build those healthy habits early on to showcase age is not a barrier. We want to accommodate and include an incredibly diverse level of players, because there's something that each player athlete can learn from the other. And look, for those of you who are interested, we do have scholarships available on AM8 International, as well as options to work with me exclusively to optimize your performance, specifically to nudge you closer towards the top 10, or those who are currently within the top 10 to maintain that hold alongside or coinciding with those peak performances and ensuring they remain cyclical. However, places are limited, so don't be shy, come and say hi. Look, on that note, thank you so much for listening. I'm so incredibly grateful. I am your host, Dr. Ashley Morgan Berge, and this is Beyond Top 10 Tennis, and I'll see you next time.